Hey guys, so I was initially going to make this video on trying to add React to an existing project, but I figured it would probably make more sense to first cover the idea of the front-end build process as a concept, just to make sure all of our bases are covered. So that's what we'll be talking about today. If you do find any of this information useful, feel free to drop a like, comment, subscribe, and that will all help grow the channel. So without further ado, let's get going. Alright, so let's get going. All of the material for this episode, as always, will be found on my GitHub. I'll throw a link in the description. In this episode, we're going to be on chapter 10, which is the basic build. So we're going to start this video by talking about the front-end build, general concepts, and then just create a project. Now, most development falls into one of two categories: messing around or working on an existing setup. So it's really easy to go long periods of time without actually worrying about a lot of these things. And then, of course, you have projects like Create React App, which speed things up a lot, but it also kind of prevents us from staying connected to what we're working on. Things get so complicated, and it makes development a lot easier in certain areas, but then all of a sudden, if you need to change anything with the build process, it can be like opening up a can of worms. So let's first take a look at the concepts. New abilities and specs are added to JavaScript every year. That's where, if you've heard terms like ES6 or ES Next, I think I've heard. And these are cool new things that you can do with the language. But different browsers are responsible for implementing the functionality. So that's why, of course, you always hear about Internet Explorer being a horrible browser. And that's not even supported anymore. And so you have people using different browsers, and all of them have varying degrees of integration with the new functionality. Also, when it comes to writing styling, writing CSS directly in CSS files can be slower than other tools that have come out, like Sass. And so the general concept of front-end bundling is going to allow us to use new tools and not have to worry about the browser support. And when I say bundling, that kind of assumes transpiling as well, which is, in our case today, going to be done by Babel, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Wrong. Totally forgot to actually cover this, so I'll quickly kind of give an overview of it now. Essentially, transpiling is still writing JavaScript, but it's taking new JavaScript and turning it into essentially a different kind of JavaScript. And so if you're familiar with music, it's similar to transposing music. You might be shifting keys. Well, in this, you're taking new JavaScript and turning it still into JavaScript, but it's just an older version of JavaScript so that more browsers will actually be able to use it. I hope that makes sense. If you just Google JavaScript transpile, I'm sure there's going to be a ton of material on it, probably some nice Medium article. So it's worth looking into, but that is the basics of it. Back to me. Also, it's worth noting that we should ideally have a different build process when we're developing from when we have a production build. And that's just because there are certain tools that make things easier to debug when you're developing that you don't actually want people to have access to on a production site. Also, I noted at the bottom, even if you're using something like Babel to transpile your code down, you should still test across browsers, just because weird things can come up. And then down here, I also threw a picture in that kind of visualizes the process. You have things like JavaScript files, CSS, SCSS, PNGs for images, and then a module bundler is essentially taking those, putting them all in one place, and then you just have to worry about including that in one spot in your script. All right, so what are the tools that are used? And you've probably heard of all of these, I would imagine. Most commonly, we're going to use NPM or Yarn for package management. NPM just stands for Node Package Manager, and Yarn is essentially a newer version of that, but both get the same thing done. We'll then use webpack for our bundling, Babel for our JS, and SCSS for our styling. So I think the easiest way to handle this is just by starting into it and then kind of explain things as we go. I'll be using NPM for this example, but the steps for yarn are pretty much the same. We'll start by just saying npm init, giving it a package name. In this case, I'll just press return. I just pressed enter through everything. And if I go over to my Visual Studio Code, then we'll see that a package.json was created. And as you can see, I left pretty much everything blank for the sake of brevity. Now, in order for npm to do everything we need it to do, we need to install specific things. So in this case, we need to install webpack and the webpack CLI, and those will be saved dev because that's part of our development process. So I'll run that. And that did not take too long. Finally, we're going to create our webpack.config.js file. And this is essentially where we're going to configure our bundling. In order to speed these up, I copied all of the different steps in a different directory so that I don't have to type them all out. But let's take a look here at what we're doing. Essentially, all we're doing here is defining an entry point and our output. The entry point is in our source.js and then index.js file. The entry will be at source, then JavaScript, then our index.js file, and the output will be in a dist for distribution directory, with the file name being main.js. I should probably actually go over the file structure here just so everyone knows what's going on. It's pretty standard to have a distribution directory where all of your output is going to end up. Right now that's empty. And then in our source, I have two different main directories, JS and CSS. In our CSS, I put main.scss, which has some styling stuff here, and it imports second.scss, which has a different set of styling. And we'll be able to test that this is working once items with the container and container __ header are properly being styled. On the JavaScript side of things, again, I'm using two different files. Index.js, which just logs that it's running, as well as second.js, which is getting imported at the start, where we're just exporting a standard function. And now it's also worth noting that I'm using new JavaScript here, in that you're defining variables in arrays, as well as using string literals. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But for now, I'm going to save that up. And then do two more things. The first is to add our output to the HTML. So in that case, I'm just going to head to the bottom here and uncomment this out. But we're just taking it from our distribution main.js, which doesn't exist yet, but will once we run our webpack. Finally, we just need to create a couple scripts that we'll be able to run to get Webpack to build our develop and then production build. And so how this works is in scripts, we are able to create custom scripts. So I'm just going to call this dev. And what I'm going to do is run Webpack, which in and of itself actually would be enough to run, but then it would give me warnings that I'm not actually defining which mode I'm in. And so what I'm going to do here is say mode equals development, and then duplicate this and create build. And instead of development, we'll say production. Now, the other thing I'm going to add to development is -- watch. And what that's going to do is instead of running this once, it's going to run it, but then watch for changes to any of the files that are affected, which means we can make changes and we don't have to go to the console again to rerun Webpack. But now that that's done, because we're in the same directory as our package.json, we can run npm run and then a script. So in this case, let's run dev. And we'll see right away, we're already accessing our index.js and it's successfully importing our second.js. And if we refresh the page, we see running from index, running from second, first followed by second, and then third. And those were the things that we had logged in our second function. Now it's also worth noting that we see index.js and second.js. If we click on that, we see the contents of the file as we see them in our editor. But I'm going to go to my console now, and instead of running dev, let's build it. So this is a production build now. If I refresh this, we're getting the same console log. The same thing's getting done, but now this is all happening in main.js. And if I click on that, we see everything's been minified, and the names of a lot of the variables are changed, which is actually what we want. We want to protect our code when we're releasing it for a production environment. But you'll see one thing that isn't being done is we're not doing anything to the JavaScript to protect against old browsers. And that is what we're going to do now with Babel. So at this point, we have a basic build process. What about these things that we talked about at the beginning? So for that functionality, you're going to see that we install a few more libraries. Babel Loader, Babel Core, Babel Preset Environment. And it looks like I threw webpack in there, but I don't need to import that again. So if I run install, everything gets included. And then all we need to do is add this to our webpack. So as I mentioned earlier, I already put that in a different file just so that I could paste it in and save. But we can quickly look at this. So essentially what we're doing here is we're running a test for files that match a certain pattern with the ability to exclude things like node modules. And then we're going to use different functionalities. So in this case, we're using the Babel loader with the presets from our Babel preset environment. And so if you just Google Webpack, you can go to their website and read their documentation on using different loaders and modules and plugins and things like that. But if I save that up and run build again, we see everything got built. So go back to here, refresh, and if I click on our main.js, here we can see now we're using backwards compatible JavaScript. We're actually just concatenating strings using our first followed by our second. And so that's the main point of Babel, is we're allowed to write new JavaScript, but feel comfortable that someone who's on an older browser most likely won't have any problem viewing or using that functionality. Now, again, if we run dev, we can refresh. And if I click on this index.js, like before, we're still able in our development environment to see the code as it's written, which helps a lot when you're debugging. Now, I don't think I actually pointed this out earlier, but just to reiterate another point of having the development environment is if I say running from index bro, and I save this, if you look at here again, it identified that change without having to rerun anything. And if I refresh, we see running from index bro. So that also just speeds up your development process. Now, what about styling? Let's get sassy. Well, again, we need to install some different libraries. So we're going to include style loader, CSS loader, Sass loader, and node Sass. And so I will stop that process. And once again, npm I is just a shortcut for npm install. And that now finished. So again, we're going to update our webpack.config. Pasted that in. And what we're doing here is again adding a new rule where we're testing, and this is giving us all the CSS files and SCSS files. And then we're going to use this style loader, CSS loader, and then our Sass loader, which in the end is going to compile our Sass to CSS. And once we get this part done, we have one final step, which is including that in our JavaScript. Now this might seem a little odd, but you have to remember that in our webpack config, our entry point is this index.js file. So webpack is going to go to our index.js. Once it's importing this specific file, it's going to catch this .scss, and then it's going to recognize that pattern and use our style loader and our CSS loader and our Sass loader to separate that out. So if I run that dev, now we see it's recognizing our main.scss file. We have our header black. If I refresh, we see our header is now gray, and it's in this div. So we can inspect that and see we have our container, and then we have our container __ header, where we write header. And as I showed earlier, that's written in our second.scss file. So that's where SCSS can come in handy. Instead of writing our container styling and then writing our container __ header, we're able to contain all of that functionality into one hierarchy. So if you haven't learned about SCSS at all yet, it's definitely something that you should learn. It's an industry standard at this point, and it will speed up your styling by quite a bit, I think. Now, I did also want to note that for a full production ready setup, CSS should actually be extracted into a main.css file. And the main reason for that is that our CSS is dependent on the JavaScript right now. But if someone's blocking JavaScript, you still want them to be able to see the site, even if the functionality is not completely working. And there are ways to do that with Webpack. I didn't think it was worth going into that detail because this was just a general overview of the basic setup. But if you get to the point where you're working on a project, where you're ready for that production launch, then that's something you definitely want to make sure that you look into. So what is the end result of all of this? Well, we're using a package manager that's going to give us smaller production file sizes, because when we're running in production, things get minified. Not only that, but we're able to write modern JavaScript without worrying as much about older browsers, as well as use modern styling with Sass. All of this results in a massive amount of front-end swag that you should be very proud of if you did this. If you didn't do this and you watched it, if you thought it made sense, I definitely think it's something you should do, play around with, because even if you don't anticipate needing to launch a production-ready site anytime soon, it's something you want to get familiar with, and that with just a little bit of time is pretty easy to get the hang of. I should also note, we used Webpack here. I didn't go too much into detail about Webpack, and that's because in terms of use by companies, it's probably the largest that's used, but you also have things like Parcel and other things, and for that, you would just Google JS bundling, and you can just research more about that. But like I said, if you search bundling, Webpack is going to probably be the main result. All right, great. Hope you guys liked the video. I hope you found it useful. I hope you followed along. If you have any questions, feel free to leave comments below. Again, like I said before, subscribe for more content like this. Likes and comments are all going to help grow the channel. Hope you guys have a good day, and I'll catch you next time. See ya.